Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Zoutra. Well, we're in week 2 of the spring semester, and I must say it is shaping up to be a very, very nice semester. All the coursework is completed, and thus I'm only having to take a couple of classes that I want to take for fun and to keep my mind stimulated, which I'm very happy about. I'm teaching public oral communications again this term, as I taught it in the fall. And it turns out that the couple of sections I'm teaching are philosophy of science and medicine related sections. So there are several students in the course who are taking the class specifically for the philosophy of science and medicine component. And it also turns out that several students do not want the class to be science focused, maybe some science phobic students. So I'm still considering ways in which to merge the two subjects and to how to teach good public speaking and rhetoric practices by showing examples from the philosophy of science or perhaps from the scientists themselves. So I'll let you guys know how that goes. Also, let's see. The end of this first week was pretty interesting. Ended with the Graduate and Professional Student Association's social hour on Friday. You guys are probably familiar with this if you've attended university. The GPSG is a graduate student group that gets together, and usually there's one at every university. And they hold these, monthly social hours with the goal of connecting different graduate students from different departments. And so I happen to have never gone to one in my 3.5 years in school, and decided to go to this one with a couple of friends. And it turned out to be, for the most part, really fun. Met some people that I'd known from psychology and some classes that I've taken there. Met some really cool people in biology, informatics, computer science. And I even met one gentleman, an astrophysicist. I believe he does work on neutron stars. He didn't get too much into detail to it, but it sounded pretty interesting. And we ended up getting into talks about finishing and finding jobs. He's just finishing up and going off for some interviews in the next few weeks. So got to talk about what is required of that. And as well, I happened to share with him a little about the podcast and what this is, the Sci-Fi Podcast. And I got the age-old question that philosophers of science do get from some scientists, which is, what is philosophy of science? And what do philosophers of science actually do? And I proceeded to give him what I consider to be a pretty reasonable explanation of what philosophers of science do. But I found during our friendly discussion that there was a bit of a disconnect, and he was a little hard pressed of convincing of the current value or utility, especially with philosophy of science related to the science. There's this consideration with whenever you have a study of something, a philosophy of something. It could be, relatively easy to dismiss that study, as equivalent to being, say, ornithology for birds. The birds being not particularly, they don't care that much about the ornithology, since the scientists might not always care as much about those who study it from a different kind of point of view. However, we got talking about it, and we kept talking. We had a really nice chat and discussion, and I thought it was very worthwhile. But it got me, motivated to think a little bit more deeply about the very question of what does philosophy of science, other than an intellectual field, contribute to the science itself. And I thought I would open this question out to you, the listeners. And if you would like, I would appreciate it if you would email your responses to the question, what does philosophy of science contribute to the science, to the podcast, to me, and I will share them in the next couple of episodes on the air. So if you have an idea, an intelligible thought, a claim you'd like to advance, email them to Zoutra. That's N, the initial, my first name, Nick, and Zoutra, my last name. So that's NZAUTRA at indiana.edu. And like I said, would love to share your responses in the next couple of episodes. So the 6th episode today is a very fun one. We have Rick Grush, professor of philosophy at UC San Diego, and the director of the UCSD Summer Program for Women in Philosophy. Rick's research clusters around several related topics, and in most cases, his methodology combines philosophical, scientific, and historical investigations. He has worked mostly on the nature of spatial perception, how is it we are able to perceive space and spatial relations, and the neural information processing mechanisms that support this. A close second is the nature of temporal perception, and another major interest has been the nature of mental representation, and in particular, the neural mechanisms the brain uses to represent. He is also very interested in language, especially demonstratives, and his approach to semantics comes from the cognitive linguistics tradition. He is very interested in the work of Gareth Evans, the British philosopher, and he has published quite a bit of material on his views. He also has ongoing projects on the nature of subjectivity and also the nature of group minds. So Rick and I get into quite a fun, lengthy chat and get to hear a little bit about Rick's upbringings and his interesting points of views, and also in our similar backgrounds of having attended both a joint PhD program in both philosophy and that of cognitive science. And it's really great. Rick's been around since the early days, since the coming ins of at least the more contemporary, the past 20, 30 years philosophy of science. So it's great to hear some of the points of view and stories and some of the really big ideas in cognitive science back in the 90s that were just coming to fruition. And also Rick gets to talking in the second half of the episode about his particular views with academic publishing. And Rick is one who really does like to break the boundaries and do what he likes to do. And so we get to talking about a little bit more towards the benefits of open access publishing, and publishing, kind of self-publishing, I suppose, publishing on academia.edu exclusively, working with your paper, avoiding word limits, and being able to do pretty much whatever you want with the written word and your work. So, it's a fascinating talk. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did speaking with Rick. And let's go ahead and bring him in. Welcome, Rick Grush, to the Sci-Fi Podcast. Welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot for having me. It's great to be here.
Oh, that is fantastic. So where are you coming from? Where are you calling us from?
Well, I'm in San Diego, currently at UCSD, and I'm not traveling at the time, so just hanging out at home, getting some work done, and talking a little bit about philosophy of science.
That sounds great. Are you so are you at the home office? Is this do you typically do work at home? Or are you working out at the office on campus? What's your preference?
Normally, I work either at home or just coffee shops around town. That's sort of a habit I got into quite a while ago, and I find it a little more relaxing. It's nice to be in an environment where people aren't going to disturb you. On campus, there's a lot of disturbances, and there's people who will give me coffee or muffins whenever I want. So
it's nice to be located next to caffeine and other food when you're doing your work.
Definitely.
Well, cool. Well, thanks for coming on. So, let's go ahead and get started. So tell us, where are you from, Rick?
Born in Oregon, actually, Southern Oregon. My dad was in the Air Force, so moved around quite a bit as a kid. Most of my formative years were actually in Northern California, in Sacramento. Then went to UC Davis, as an undergrad. I'm not sure, what scope.
No. I'm curious. So you grew up in Oregon. So you were born in Oregon, but your military family. What did Dad do? What did he do in the military?
He was basically a weatherman in the Air Force. He releasing weather balloons.
Okay.
Was what he did. Yeah. So nothing super exciting there, but it did mean that for the first 5 years or so of my life, I think I lived in 18 different places.
Oh my gosh. Do you remember any of it, or was
a little bit? I remember Guam. Guam was kind of funky with
Great. How about Mom? Was she? Were you guys moving around together? Was that going on? Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Cool. Great. And so you say you spent most of your years. Was that in Sacramento? Did you do high school there?
Yeah, definitely. Went to high school there, and then ended up going to UC Davis, mostly just because it was really close. to, where I was, growing up and my family and everything, which is sort of a common occur, I think. So I was a first generation college student, and sort of also from a kind of low income background. And, sure. As I've been looking into this, for reasons that may come up later, that's actually fairly common, is for, people who are first generation students or for low income backgrounds, kind of like staying closer to home, being, for a variety of reasons, being less likely to sort of, cruise across the country to, go to college somewhere else. So I guess I fit that pattern there.
Well, yeah, from my experience, there is a certain understanding of what it means to go to school is very different from in first generational contexts. And I say that because my wife happens to be a first generational student, and was a first generational student, is a first generational student, and so I've gotten a little bit of experience talking with her and learning more and more about what it's like. I'm sure it's different for different folks, but yeah. And there's a lot of different kinds of first generation and low income as well. But it's by no means is it a kind of uniform experience. Yeah, and couched as such as I don't think to respect maybe the quality of what it is and what it means. Yeah, as a first gen student. So did you went to UC Davis but in high school though, growing up, I mean, what caught your eyes in terms of interests or things you like to do? Well, mostly I was just sort of just good at math and physics type stuff, going up in middle school and high school. It just sort of came easily to me. Mm-hmm. And so when I went to Davis, started at Davis, that was kind of my initial track, was just kind of staying in a kind of math, physics, engineering sort of, track of one sort or another, at least when I first got there. I mean, that eventually changed, but so, another feature of being sort of a, first generation student is that you don't get the same kind of, top down, guidance / pressure or whatever from your family, right? I mean, they're generally just happy if you're doing well in school and you might go to college, right? And at that level of grain, that's enough for them. So there's not a whole lot of, in my life and in many people's experience, there wasn't a whole lot of discussion about, okay, here's these different career paths. And if you want to, end up here, then you need to start doing these things now. So it was pretty much just going, through the path of least resistance, which for me was kind of math, physicsy type stuff. That was just the stuff that kind of came easily. Okay. And so so what came easily? You went in. Did you have any ideas in high school? What you wanted to do when you grew up, when you got older? Some sort of engineering or nuclear physics or something like that. Again, these weren't like super well-formed ideas, but, something along those lines was kind of, what I was, what I was envisioning, as a future career. Sure. And was this something that, you talked to your parents about, or is this something you had, any other advisees or mentors, to discuss with you, or is this something you kind of came to on your own? More or less just came to on my own. And again, not because I knew a whole lot about what a career like that would involve. It was just sort of extrapolating from, well, given that these are my interests, what would be some, interesting sounding career options down the path? And if, for someone interested in physics, right, again, if you're one of the issues with being a first generation student is you just don't really know the options, right? So even things like, graduate school is a kind of mystery, for a lot of first generation students, right? And so if you're interested in physics, but you don't really know much about what's going to happen after college, like what even the options are, something like, an engineer, like someone working in a nuclear power plant, or something like that, where that's the thing that sort of seems to you like, oh, that's what a physicist could do. So that was about the level of detail I was at. No, I can relate and understand that kind of experience. You're not given at 18, oh, well, this is what you do and these are the courses you take, and this is what it means to go to graduate school in physics or something like that. You were kind of have to figure it out as you go.
Yeah, at least in my case. Definitely.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it could be different in different cases. But, or graduate school is pitched as like sort of the continuation of school. The justification for it isn't very clear. Why is it? So I know, again, like my experience has been, with my wife who, her family will reach out to her and she's in a graduate doctoral program now and they'll say like, oh, you're still, I thought you already went to school will be the comment there. And, it's just like fleshing out exactly what it is. It's not always clear,
right.
in that context. Well, so how do you like Davis?
Davis was great. I really enjoyed Davis a lot. Like I said, when I first got there, I was,
you were in math and physics or?
Yeah, doing, math, physics, engineering type courses. And, the very first, quarter I was there, I also took a philosophy just to fill one intro to philosophy course, just, to have something that wasn't involving math somewhere in my schedule. Mm-hmm. And it was a pretty amazing class. I mean, I credit that class. It was taught by Michael Wadeen, who's now retired. But, it was unbelievable class. And I wasn't sure what happened. I didn't know anything about philosophy. And at the end of the term, I still don't think I knew much about philosophy. It was just, my brain had just gone through a blender. But I knew that whatever had just happened was something that was really interesting and really kind of cool. And so even though I was still, on the kind of math and physics track, I continued to kind of take philosophy classes just as a sort of, side gig because they were really interesting to me.
Yeah. Do you recall a particular class you really liked?
It's a very different department now. Obviously, I don't really know a whole lot about the specifics of what it's like now, but at the time it was a great department. It was very history oriented. So in addition to Michael Wadeen's intro class, which was in retrospect unbelievable, this was a 10-week quarter and he taught, it was broken down into 4 units. There was ethics, metaphysics, epistemology, and arguments for the existence of God. Wow. This is all in 10 weeks, mind you.
Yeah, the quarter system.
Yeah, just to give you a flavor, in the epistemology, we read Descartes' Meditations, we read selections from Hume, we read Kant, including the synthetic a priori. I mean, and that was just in like a 2-week section on epistemology. And of course, at the time, I had no idea that this was just an insane amount of material to be, trying to do in 2 weeks or 10 weeks if you include the other topics. So in retrospect, I look back and just think, wow, that was nuts. I mean, Wadeen did an amazing job with it. Mm-hmm. But so I would say that class, and then I also took a philosophy of mind course with G.J. Maddie, who's still at UC Davis, and that was a great class also. And I think that was sort of what pushed me in the direction of philosophy of mind, philosophy of cog sci, which is kind of what I'm doing now. The text that he used was John Hoagland's Mind Design. And so there was a lot of, it was Phil Mind, but it was with a very kind of, cog sci angle to it.
Mm-hmm. So when was the switch? When did philosophy become the more primary method with which you were interested in doing work?
Well, it switched sort of after I came back to Davis. So I actually left college for a while after a couple of years because I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. Right, I was doing the math and physics initially just because it kind of came easily to me, but it started losing its interest. Right, in a certain sense. I mean, when you first start doing physics, it's fascinating, but then at a certain point, it becomes, well, now we're just going to learn new techniques for solving harder versions of these problems. Sort of the interesting conceptual stuff kind of, especially at the undergraduate level, but even, at the graduate level in many cases, the interesting conceptual stuff kind of peters out. And at the time, philosophy didn't really seem like, I had no idea that, what a philosophy career would be like. So I actually just left undergraduate and I don't know if dropped out is quite the right word, because I always kind of thought, well, maybe I'll go back and finish my degree at some point.
Sure, it wasn't like I'm dropping out, I'm never, coming back or something. But
yeah, the door was kind of open.
Yeah, but, sure.
I was just out of college for a couple of years, just sort of working full time, making some money, and then at a certain point, I sort of realized, I could probably go back. I really did enjoy philosophy. I'll finish up the philosophy degree.
Did you have any interesting jobs while you were out, or just sort of work to get by? I
don't know if they were interesting. I was working mainly at the Penny Saver, which is it's a direct mail advertiser, which I don't even know.
Yeah, I remember the Penny Saver being back in the 80s and the 90s. I know we had that in the newspaper. I don't know if that was like a cross national feature, but before online ads, the Penny Saver was. Oh, that was his own publication, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. It was a direct mail advertiser, and so every week, we would just this thing would show up in everyone's mailboxes, whether they wanted it or not. And so I started off, in some sort of low level position as a runner driving, whatever between point A and point B. Eventually sort of worked my way up to the night shift supervisor in the production department. So the production department, that was the group that was responsible for actually, creating the physical stuff, right? So doing the typesetting, doing the artwork and the layout, and those sorts of things. There were a couple other departments. There were the salespeople who would go and sell display ad space. So all of the people who bought like these full page ads to sell, whatever, ceiling fans or
sure.
So the salespeople, that was one department. Then there were the reader ad people. So those were the people taking the orders for the, essentially classified ads. And then the production department. And so that's where I worked. And it kind of came in handy, because then when I went back to Davis, I had, these sort of production skills. And so when I went back to Davis, I was the production manager of the school newspaper there.
Okay. Was there some interest in editorial work in your future at the time, or was this more of like, this is something you could do, this was a skill that you had?
It was mostly a skill. I mean, I did write. I did a few things. So I did some like concert reviews that I wrote, and I did some comedy pieces from time to time that would show up in the paper itself. But
what kind of comedy pieces?
Just ridiculous, abstract stuff. I mean, I kind of wish I still had some copies.
Some
of those
satirical
things.
stuff, like just random poems or comedy.
Exactly, more along that line. Just random,
very fun
stuff.
Fun.
But yeah, so the kind of typesetting and layout skills kind of came in handy when I went back to Davis.
Very nice. So out of college for a couple of years, went back to Davis. Did you enter in as a philosophy major, or what were you thinking?
I don't really remember, but I think at that point I had kind of transitioned out of math and physics, at least as my idea for what I was going to pursue, and probably had landed on philosophy, although I may not have actually declared the major until the very end.
Sure.
But at least at that point, I knew kind of what the end game was, and I knew I enjoyed doing philosophy. So
what do you think it was about doing philosophy, the process of doing it, that as opposed to doing physics or doing math, that really, I don't know, how did you come to terms with what it is you like to do that just felt like this is what I want to do, as opposed to these the sciences or the more formal mathematics?
Yeah, that's a good question. What I think it was, and this sort of gets kind of like some of my ideas about what philosophy is, but this is kind of what appealed to me about it, is that philosophy is this interesting combination that, on the one hand, it's a kind of a domain where we want to have knowledge of some sort, right? So that sets it apart from, arts in a certain kind of way, right? Because the goal of art isn't really to sort of, gain a knowledge of something. It's got a kind of other creative dimension. But on the other hand, unlike some of the other areas, in math and physics where we gain knowledge, it always struck me there was an element of creativity that was missing in some of those fields. Whereas philosophy kind of has this interesting combination of on the one hand, having as its goal something like, some kind of progress or knowledge of some domain, an ability to kind of get a conceptual grasp on something. But at the same time, requiring more creativity than is usual in those fields. And I think it's because, generally speaking, the fields that philosophers are engaged with are fields where we don't really have the conceptual framework nailed down quite yet for how to approach knowledge in that domain. And so there is a little bit more creativity that is helpful and useful and even required to sort of make gains in a field when, even the basic conceptual resources are up for grabs.
Yeah.
And I think that was the combination that appealed to me, is sort of, on the one hand, a kind of rigor and a kind of desire to make gains, but then on the other hand, it just being a more difficult kind of domain where, everything was, nothing was really settled conceptually yet. And so there was more of a premium on creativity.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying this comment. I've wondered myself what it is that I'm particularly interested in, drawn to philosophy, and I know for myself, I definitely enjoy a lot of creative aspects and endeavors. And I used to, when doing science and psychology, consider the art of the experiment, for example, of creating really fun experiments requires some sort of creativity as well. But I think there is perhaps additional room in philosophy for those using and utilizing creativity in the way that you're describing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So you transitioning on, once you made the switch, like how did it go to, going into philosophy to thinking about graduate school?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I guess I can say a couple of things about that. One is, at the time, this is late in, very late 80s when I was pretty close to finishing up, I actually got engaged. That ended up not working out.
Okay.
But, when one gets engaged, you might start thinking about, what sorts of, career options are available that, seem like they're more stable. And before you start laughing, philosophy sounds like not that such a great, safe career choice, unless the other options that you're considering are something like, rock musician and comedy writer. Then,
yep.
Right.
Are you telling me that maybe those were kind of on the table? Maybe.
Yeah. Those were
Did you also play? Did you play music as well, or do you play music as well?
Yeah, guitar.
Very cool, very nice.
A couple bands. And so it was something I enjoyed. I also enjoyed kind of comedy writing type stuff, because I did a little bit for the Aggie. But, and then the other thing I really enjoyed was philosophy. And so for that reason, I kind of veered towards philosophy. I guess I didn't really have a super good idea of just what a dicey career move that was at the time. But that was part of it. And then also, towards the end of my undergraduate time at Davis, one of the grad students there and I read Paul Churchland's Scientific Realism and the Plasticity of Mind. Sure. And I just loved that book. It really kind of had a big impact on me. And so, almost immediately I started, thinking, I'd really like to go to UCSD and work with Paul Churchland. And then eventually, kind of that plan eventually materialized.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. And so you went over around, when did you start?
1990.
Okay, great. And so who's over there at the time at UCSD? Who were some of the faculty?
Oh, they were pretty stacked at the time. Yeah. So the Churchlands were there. Henry Allison was there. Bob Pippin. The Kitchers were there. There were a lot of people who were big shots who were there. So it was a lot of fun, and a lot of great faculty, great grad students.
But so at the time when you were coming in, though, philosophy, you've gone, philosophy to philosophy of science. Was this in the field, or were you thinking philosophy of mind?
More philosophy of mind or philosophy of cog-sci.
Okay, yeah.
Because, at the time, connectionism was kind of big, and it was in sort of philosophy of cog-sci circles. And, with a math and physics background, there was a lot of that same kind of formalism was being used by the people in connectionist modeling. And so my idea was, well, I'll go to UCSD, work with Paul Churchland, do something on connectionism and philosophy of mind, and that'll kind of be my path. That was kind of my initial idea going in.
Mm-hmm. And how did you like UCSD?
It was great. It was great, and there's a number of things about it that were true then and are also true now about UCSD. One of the things I liked about it that is still true is there's a lot of freedom at UCSD. So, I was able to sort of do graduate work in all kinds of different disciplines. I mean, nobody blinked an eye. There's enough of a history of interdisciplinary work, even at the time, this is back in the 90s, that people in other departments in psych or whatever, they would not blink if a philosophy graduate student showed up and, wanted to sit in on a seminar or do some, lab work or whatever. Sure. Which especially at the time was rare. I think now it's more common. There's more of a history of interdisciplinary work. But at the time, I think UCSD was, if not unique, at least in rarefied air when it comes to how easy it was to sort of work with other fields. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of the things that I really appreciated. And Paul Churchland was very hands-off as an advisor, which was great because I kind of had my own ideas about what I wanted to do. And so he
let you go with it. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, I'm coming to see that the hands-off approach it can be very useful. Having folks there when needed for some guidance or review is really good. But I mean, I feel like graduate school is a time where you need to make the transition from a graduate student to a researcher or a scholar yourself. And I think that's a really a worthwhile thing that fits in with the hands-off approach.
Yeah. And some students are different. I think there are some students who really do thrive better with more
sure.
support and management. But I'm definitely sort of on the opposite end of that spectrum. I thrive more in an environment where I'm kind of left to my own devices.
So what kinds of ideas were you thinking about during graduate school? What were you interested in working on?
Well, there are a couple of strands. One strand is one of the faculty who actually also started in 1990 was Adrian Cousins, and he was part of this kind of Oxford or UK Strawson Evans line of people, and I worked with him and sort of gained an appreciation especially for the work of Gareth Evans, which has turned out to sort of have a big footprint on my whole career. I've done a lot, worked a lot with, on Evans' work and published things that are kind of like inspired by Evans on spatial representation and demonstratives and some other topics. So that was kind of one strand. More central to my sort of philosophy of mind, cog sci. Like I said, when I first went in, my thinking was I was going to be doing work in sort of connectionism. Mm-hmm. And one of the issues, though, for me was that with connectionist models, for me, the notion of representation was really important. But within the connectionist framework, especially at the time, there were basically two things you could do if you were a connectionist. You could either just be sort of an eliminativist of one sort or another with respect to representation, or you could embrace representation, but you had to sort of redefine it and water it down in this way that just left you with something very unsatisfactory. And so that was what I was kind of struggling with that, right? How can I make room for a robust notion of representation within a kind of connectionist framework? And my second year as a graduate student, there was a year-long graduate sequence in electrical and computer engineering on neurocomputing, taught by Robert Heck Nielsen. And so I decided to take that in part because it was an ECE class, so they weren't skimping on the math. They didn't care about philosophy of mind or cog sci or the brain at all. Mm-hmm. It was all engineering applications of neurocomputing architectures, and so it was just a fantastic class. But then about halfway through, in the second quarter, sometime, the topic turned to control theory and various applications of these things in control theoretic contexts. And in particular, one of the topics that came up is forward models, how you could use neurocomputing architectures to to train them to become forward models, which would then help in all kinds of different ways, learning, and I'm just sitting in this class going, by the way, I should have asked you this early on. Are you shooting for a non-explicit rating in your podcast there?
No, you can be as much as you. I'm shooting for explicit. Well, I don't. Say what you want to say. That's fine.
Okay, good. Okay, so anyway, I'm sitting in this class listening to stuff and going, holy shit, this is exactly what I've been looking for, because you've got these systems now which are creating models of another entity that they're interacting with. And I just realized this is exactly what I've been looking for. And so it really, literally at that point, that set my dissertation project, which was sort of, articulating this kind of framework and showing how this could be used as a sort of framework for understanding representation generally in the brain. And I mean, now looking back at that, it, seems, it can seem, well, obviously, but at the time in 1992, nobody was doing that. There were a handful of people in CogSci who were kind of using the notion of forward models in very specific contexts. So, Masao Ito, who was a Japanese motor physiologist, he had proposed that the cerebellum had a forward model of the body. Sure. There were a few people working in visual perception who were using forward models as parts of Kalman filtering stuff to explain certain features of visual perception, and a couple other little micro applications. But nobody had been sort of arguing for this as a general purpose way to understand neural representational activity. And so it was a lot of fun because it was, it just sort of wrote itself. Yeah, because as I started trying to apply this to various things, I mean, I still think that it's the way to go. And maybe this is going to sound, I don't know what the word is, not sufficiently humble. I don't know, but when you sort of stumble upon the truth, it turns out that it's easy to defend, right? That it just kind of holy crap,
things fall in place, and sure,
and it's kind of wrote itself. And so that was fortuitous in retrospect, right? Because now that I'm on the other end of it and trying to with advisees and stuff, I see how difficult it is sometimes for people to find a dissertation topic that really speaks to them. That's not everybody is as lucky as I was and just kind of has this epiphany moment in one class that just sort of sets their dissertation
agenda.
It all
makes sense. Yeah. So was this? I was looking. Is this your emulation and cognition paper or no? That's
emulation.
Oh, this is. It is. Yeah.
That's
your dissertation is on Google Scholar. It is. Great. It's got. It's been cited quite a few times. Nice. Very nice. That's not often for a dissertation too.
How many times has it been cited?
Looks like it's 89 citations.
Oh wow! Yeah,
but and then your most cited paper is still at 1,007, which is the BBS article. Which
right, which is on the same topic.
Mm-hmm. So is it just more expanded a little bit? And I imagine
it goes more deeply into the math, but it's also more focused in a certain way because the BBS article was really written specifically for a kind of CogSci audience, right? Neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, psychologists. Not really so much for philosophers. So the audience was a little bit different with that paper.
Sure. I see. Did you work with Ramachandran, or he was on a survey committee? How was that? How was that interacting with him?
It was a blast. He's really an amazing, brilliant person to work with. But I was involved in his lab for a couple of years. I quickly learned that I prefer sort of being involved with labs in a kind of, theoretical capacity.
Yeah.
Show up to the lab meetings, help, brainstorm about controls and stuff like that. But then when it comes to actually running the experiment and, spending 45 minutes, counting neurons under a microscope or something like that.
Loads of fun. Yeah.
I didn't really have the patience for that. But he was great, and he was more than happy to have me sort of be around for a couple of years in a sort of theoretical capacity.
That's fantastic. Yeah, he was someone. He's had success. I think maybe in the early 2000s with kind of as a celebrity scientist for a little while. I don't know if he's carrying that on as much, but he definitely has been inspirational to, I think, a lot of folks who have gone into philosophy of mind or philosophy of cog-sci with his sort of appearance in the consciousness literature and kind of a bridging as a scientist. I don't know. Is he a neurologist as well, or is he mainly a cognitive neuroscientist?
He's, well, mostly in terms of like the experimental stuff, it's psychology. I mean, his experiments are psych experiments. Now, his background, I believe he has an MD. I mean, so he's very, he's very aware of the neuroscience of things, and he, collaborates with people doing the neuroscience. But in terms of like his lab and the kinds of experiments that are being run in his lab, they're really psych experiments, right? So if you look at the, like the phantom limb experiments or, some of the visual perception experiments, those are all kind of psych. They have clear sort of neuroscience connections, but the specific experiments are very psych. Yeah.
Okay. So it sounds like you had some very success with this this dissertation project, and so how did it go about? What was next after UCSD? Was this straight to the job market? Was this considering other options? What were you up to?
Well, I sort of got lucky because somehow, I'm still not sure how, but Andy Clark, who was, they had just started the PNP program at WashU in St. Louis. I think they started that in 93. Okay. And so Andy Clark and Bill Bechtel were there. They had just been going, Dave Chalmers, they had the postdocs program that was there. And Dave Chalmers was, I think, one of the two first postdocs. And they're there for like a 2-year rotation. And so, in 95, there was time to get, a couple more postdocs to come in. And so Andy Clark somehow was familiar with my work and liked it. And so just contacted me and said, hey, if you're interested, to come out to WashU. I don't remember exactly how it went down, if he just said, hey, you've got the job, or if he said, oh, send us some material and we'll put you in a hopper. I don't remember.
Sounded like he really, sounded like though he recruited to come there. It sounded like. Yeah,
but one way or another, I ended up not having to go on the job market because I just went straight to.
Wow. Oh, that's sort of. Oh, I see. So this was sort of like just out of before even considering it was just like, okay, I have this postdoc. Very nice.
So that whole process happened before the job market really got going.
Sure.
And so that was nice. It kind of, meant that I didn't have the usual kind of stress that people might have jumping straight into the job market.
Okay. Well, that's great. So how was the time over at WashU?
Oh, it was great. It was awesome. Just some amazing grad students there. It was very exciting to be part of that. Not initially. I wasn't there like day one because it started in 93, but it was still very early. It was only the third year. And, a lot of excitement whenever you have something like that going on. Andy Clark was there. Bill Bechtel was there. Grad students who are very, really just great grad students.
Can you think of any, grad students who might have come out of that program who might be still around now?
Yeah, well, Pete Mandick, for example. I think he started as a first year the same year I started as a postdoc. Jonathan Waskin. There's actually quite a few grad students. Chris Eliasmith, whose work is just amazing. He was also a grad student there at the time. So it was a really kind of exciting place to be, definitely.
Yeah. Well, there's something about it, too, because a lot of it, sounds like most, if not all, of the students in this PNP program are in philosophy of neuroscience, philosophy of cognitive science, philosophy of mind, empirical philosophy of mind. So you do have this, I imagine, a lot of people with a similar interest. That must be a pretty exciting place to be.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it was great. And it was, another respect in which I just got very fortunate in my career that I was able to spend a couple of years there.
Yeah. And so I was checking out. So you went next. It looks like you went to Denmark.
Yeah. So
what was that like?
Again, it was an amazing experience. So what happened was I was again getting ready to go on the job market, and I had given a talk in Denmark at a big conference. And there was a guy there, Perel Brandt, who was the head of the Center for Semiotic Research, which was basically the center that got a huge amount of money from the Danish government. And he kind of wanted to add an element of, kind of cog-sci stuff to a kind of more traditional semiotic approach to understanding meaning and mind type stuff.
Sure.
And so he was there. I guess the center was one of the co-sponsors of this big conference, and he heard me give a talk, and he must have liked it or something, because again, he just like offered me this job, like pretty much on the spot. He said, "Oh, this is great. We've got the center, we've got a lot of money. What would you think about, coming here next year as a Mitarbeiter," which is basically like a research associate or something, essentially a postdoc type position.
Sure.
And again, I just said, "Wow, that's fantastic. Sign me up." And so, so I went and lived in Denmark for a year, which was just amazing. The center was great. They had a lot of funding, a lot of interesting things going on, and Denmark was awesome. I lived in Aarhus for the first 6 months, and then Copenhagen for the second 6 months.
Oh, wow. Okay. And was this some of the work you were doing, was this a continuation of some of the emulation and cognition work and notions of representation, or what?
Definitely.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. And so getting these postdocs, did you find the postdoc experience, was that a very worthwhile thing for you?
Definitely was, because for just the reasons you would think. It's in both cases there wasn't a lot of teaching load, and so it kind of gives you time to get to work on a research profile that can help sort of jumpstart your career, which is tougher to do if your first job out of your PhD has a heavy teaching load.
Sure.
Not that it's impossible, but if you can get a year or two of postdoc where you can just start that transition and get things going, it's a huge benefit. So yeah, definitely, I was very lucky in both of those respects.
That's very fortunate. That's really great. So your first job, how did you land your, I guess, first official job?
That was at Pitt. That was there's a story behind that I haven't told a whole lot of people, but
would love to hear it if you're willing to share.
Oh, I'm willing to share. Depending on how much time you have, I have a lot of stories that not a lot of people know. But here's one. So
sure.
I'm in Denmark. It's we're coming up on the 1998 job cycle, and I get the jobs for philosophers. I'm going through it, and I'm trying to find the jobs to apply to. And I've got a list of like 23 jobs that look like they're kind of more or less up my alley. So I get there's like mailing. This was all physical mail in that day, right? No electronic applications. So I get this a sheet of mailing labels, right, for addresses, and I type all the addresses into my computer. I'm getting ready to print it out, but the sheet is 8x3. There's 24 labels on it, and I've got 23 places that I'm applying to.
Sure.
So I think, well, what the hell? Let's go back.
Let's fill it all up, right?
Let's go back to the jobs for philosophers and go through something that I'd skipped over. And at the time, Pitt had advertised for a position, and it was open. I think it was advertised as open rank, and the area was open, but preference for some kind of value theory, which is why I just thought, okay, I don't know anything about ethics.
Sure.
Right. So I just kind of left that off. But, I've got one more label, so I went ahead and filled that out and sent it off. And, sure enough, I ended up getting that job at Pitt. It was great. And there was a lot of things about Pitt that I really liked, and a lot of lessons that I've kept with me. And one of the things that really impressed me with Pitt, both in terms of the interview process. So I don't know if you've gone on the job market yet, but
in a couple years, in a couple years.
There's a variety of experiences one can have being on the applier, the applicant end of the process. And some places are really prepared, and those interviews tend to go pretty well. Other places are not very prepared. They haven't really read your stuff. You get questions that are not quite on the mark, and the interview goes kind of awkwardly because it's hard to communicate. I went into that Pitt interview And there were 8 people in the room, which was just like way more than anybody else had at any interview.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
And it was crazy. And the 8 people who were in there are just nuts, right? There's like Bob Random is there, and like,
oh geez,
wow.
just like oh my god.
And they start asking me questions about not only stuff I had sent, but they had like taken everything from my website, and they had clearly read stuff I hadn't even sent them, and were asking me just all kinds of other questions.
Oh boy.
Like they had done their homework really well. The interview was great because, it's a lot easier to have a conversation with people who, are prepared for a deep conversation.
Yeah.
And that same experience kind of, when I was there and saw just how they operated, was the same sort of thing. In graduate admissions, the entire department gets involved, or at least it did, when I was there. This was, holy crap, almost 20 years ago now. But so things might be very different now. But, the last stage of the process, the whole department would have this all-day meeting where everybody would go through, the short list, and, they would bring in bagels and stuff like that. But the number of hours that the department would put into these key decisions in terms of hiring and in terms of the graduate admissions and stuff was just staggering. Jeez. And so that kind of left an impression on me in terms of like, the value you can get out of things when you take the time to assess quality. And, they did it very well. And it was just a great department. I love the people there. The grad students are amazing. And so,
where do you think they came? I mean, given that this job, I imagine you went on a couple interviews, or was this then? Yeah. So I don't know. How do you think that came to be at Pitt? Like what, this almost like very, detailed and sort of, very, a high quality interview. Did you ever find out about that or ask about that? Just like what, how do you guys come up with your process? What is it about, who came up with this idea? What are the justifications for it?
No, I never really got a sense for that other than it was just kind of part of the culture there to sort of, do things that way.
Okay.
And, as far as why they eventually kind of landed on me, I don't really know. I think I was kind of an interesting case because on the one hand, I had, some cog-sci, neuroscience, whatever, Phil-mindy chops. But on the other hand, I had done quite a bit of work, with the work of Gareth Evans and, sort of this Strauss and Evans line of trying to understand spatial representation and notions of objectivity and things like that. And so, which kind of appealed to, I think, kind of the McDowell and some of the other factions there. And so I think I just kind of got lucky that, the stuff I was doing, I was able to push a kind of combination of buttons that just resonated with some of the people who were there.
Absolutely. And so when you showed up, were you teaching ethics? Were you a value theorist, like through and through? Or did they kind of, was your presence in the market that helped them to reevaluate the position in which they were hiring for? Yeah.
Well, it was an open position. I mean, they said preference for value theory. So.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So I don't think it was, that they necessarily needed someone to do ethics.
Like it would be nice to fill the slot, but it's not essential right now.
Yeah, so I was doing some history of philosophy classes. I did, rationalism and empiricism. History of philosophy, taught logic, those sorts of things.
Great. And so there for a few years, is that correct?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Oh, great. And ultimately, I think we're going to come up on your transition to UCSD. But actually, Rick, do you mind if we take a quick break? Just like 1 or 2 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Okay, just stay on the line. I'll be right back. I'll see you in 2 minutes. All right, Rick, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate that. Great. So we were finishing up on how, your time at Pitt. You were there for 2-3 years or so?
Yeah, 2 years.
Cool. And I imagine it sounds like it was a really good time.
Yeah, it was great.
That's great. And so, so what happened in terms of, it sounds like you were there for a few years, but not too long, such that making the move to UC San Diego, how'd that come about?
Well, a position opened up at UCSD. I don't remember if it was open. I think it was an open position. And somebody, it may have been Pat Churchland, who was on my committee, but I got contacted and said, hey, why don't you apply? So I guess they didn't, the sour taste in their mouth from when I was there as a grad student.
Sounds like they,
had 5 years to dissipate. And so, I wasn't really looking to apply around because, I was at Pitt. I was really happy there. But, I am a kind of a California boy.
Yeah.
The
West Coast weather. I know it's very nice.
Yeah. And it was one thing that was kind of surprising to me when I lived in St. Louis and Denmark and then Pittsburgh is just how much of a California boy I was in terms of, lifestyle and things like that. So I went ahead and applied and, went through the process. Eventually they said, yeah, sure. We'd love to have you back. So I accepted the offer. It wasn't easy to do because, Pitt was great and I love the people there quite a bit. But, again, sometimes geographical things, and also UCSD is itself a great department and also, and it's got like such a fantastic interdisciplinary CogSci environment. So for a lot of reasons, as much as I loved Pitt and I loved my colleagues there, it was basically impossible to turn down the chance to come back to UCSD.
Sure. So on your return, what was it like? I'm curious. Yeah. What was it like to take a position, at the place with which you kind of came up and learned everything in terms of, in graduate school? What was that like?
It's like a lot of things in life where, they're kind of weird for the first 5 minutes and then,
okay, this is,
then you don't notice it anymore. Right. So, yeah. Definitely at first, it's a little weird to, a lot of the people who were faculty when I was there as a grad student. I mean, there was 5 years in between, so there was some change, but
sure.
A lot of the people were still there. And so at first, it's a little bit weird, being in a faculty meeting with, people who were, on your committee. but, it's one of those things that it doesn't take too long before it just kind of renormalizes. And so it wasn't that bad.
Nice. And so, in early 2000s till not what kinds of things have you been up to, and maybe more specifically, what have you really liked as far as your kinds of work? Like, what have you been interested in?
Yeah, there's going to be some decision points here about how much detail you want and how many things that other people haven't heard you want to go into. But
no, sure. Yeah, I'm as much detail as you would like to give.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if we go over time, you can always go back and edit out the boring stuff.
Oh, yeah. I don't think anything has been boring thus far, and I think it's very interesting. So, in terms of work, I've really, kind of the topics I've been interested in. I've still. For the first, 5 or so years after I came back to UCSD, I was still doing a lot of stuff in, with the emulation theory and trying to sort of, champion the idea of internal models as a way of understanding mental representation. Mm-hmm. And I also then was doing that kind of hand in hand with work on spatial representation, which then transitioned into temporal representation, which has been one of the things that I, in fact, am continuing to work on that. And in fact, Janan Ismail and I are kind of working on a book. So when you talk, so maybe just for the sort of the more general readers, listeners, excuse me, give me an idea of So what is this? How would you explain temporal representation?
Yeah. So the easiest way to introduce it is just to sort of point out that phenomenologically we can perceptually experience motion, right? So which then quickly raises a question, which is that, well, if we can directly perceive motion, and motion can only manifest over a temporal interval, right? Mm-hmm. Then that instantly, sort of suggests that the content of perceptual experience can't be anything that's like a snapshot in character, right? There has to be some way in which our temporal experience spans some kind of interval, a temporal interval, because that's the only way you'd be able to directly perceive motion. And so then the question is, well, what does it mean to be able to perceive a temporal interval as opposed to, just a snapshot? And so that's kind of the entryway into the topic, is what does that mean and how can we make sense of it? So I don't know if that was the non-specialist at home, but
that's perfect. Yeah. Great. So that was one of the projects with which.
Yeah, one of the projects. I've also got a project on demonstratives that I co-published with a graduate student, Amanda Bravald, but I'm also working on a follow-up that's more detailed on that. And then a couple things, general philosophy of mind. I just finished something that's available now, which is more of a general, like trying to understand what minds are kind of paper.
Okay. Yeah. So is this something of current work you're doing, or is this something that's been?
Yeah. Well, sort of. I mean, this is a paper. That's been kind of in the works for about 13 years.
Oh, really? Is this the group minds stuff, or is
this is it's a paper that I just it's just recently available called "Some Puzzles Concerning the Relation Between Minds." Brains and bodies, or brains, bodies, and environments. I can't remember the title now.
Yeah, I think I came across that. Okay.
Yeah. So those are kind of the topics that I'm working on. In addition to the topics, there have been a couple other things that I've kind of been transitioning towards in my career. One is really trying to sort of do some things with respect to diversity in the field.
Yeah. Tell me about that.
Well, so there's a couple of things. Like in 2010, more or less, plus or minus a year or two there was a period where I very nearly left academic philosophy and just, cut the rope and just went to do some different career.
Yeah, so this was in 2000, just 6 years ago.
Yeah, not too long ago. I considered going to Canada. There were a couple positions up there that were available, and I got offered, and I was very tempted to go.
What kinds of positions?
There was a couple of CRCs. There was one at Simon Fraser and Cog Sci, and then Western Ontario had a CRC.
I'm sorry, forgive me. CRC?
Oh, sorry. Canada Research Chair.
Oh, okay.
So the Canadian government very wisely, right? They said, "Hey, we want to stop the brain drain." So the government then made a large number of these CRCs, which is a Canada Research Chair that they would then give to specific universities, and the whole goal of those was to have a sort of a chair that a department could use to sort of try to attract, either attract and or prevent, the brain drain of, people, big people in the field or whatever.
Sure.
And it's been a terrific program. I think it's really kind of, done what the Canadian government set out for it to do. But there were a couple of those that I very nearly took because they're great positions, and Canada's great for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
But and then, I also just almost left the field a couple of times because I was kind of sort of getting how to put it.
Was there some burnout potentially, or just interested in doing something else, or?
It was a combination of burnout and also sort of disillusionment with certain things in the profession that were really kind of rubbing me the wrong way, actually.
Yeah.
And so I actually did resign at one point. I sent a letter to the chair of our department at the time just saying, "Hey, I'm out." And he talked me out of resigning.
So was this, I mean, I'm generally curious. I mean, I know that academia, we learn about, the kinds of things that can go on. And I mean, what were some of the, if you wouldn't mind sharing, if you have some things, there's some grievances or some things that you're, that would potentially lead you to resign?
Well, a couple of things, and I can talk about one in particular. So, sure. And this is kind of also connected to diversity in a way that I'll get to. But
great.
The field of philosophy right now is very very restricted in a couple of respects in terms of what it conceives of as philosophical value and what it conceives of as a legitimate contribution to that philosophical value. So let me give you a couple of examples, and these aren't new examples, but for instance, people have been complaining for a while about the fact that there is this kind of premium of quantity over quality, right? Yeah. That when you go on the job market, it's how many publications do you have, and not just on the job market, but in a lot of contexts.
Sure. There's what's going to get a promotion or something. Or...
Yeah, a counting of publications, and there was a really interesting blog post by Jennifer Whiting not too long ago on Daily News, I think, which I think was something like Slow Philosophy, but where she made a suggestion, kind of building on a suggestion by Annette Beyer, of sort of changing some of the requirements for tenure from, how much have you published to let a tenure applicant pick their 4 best or 5 best or, N pages of what they think is their best work and use that as an assessment. And the reasons that she had in particular were some issues that women have on the job market with biological clocks and stuff like that. And the suggestion is kind of a way to accommodate that. But I think that even apart from that specific motivation there, which is a great motivation of itself, it just is the case that there are people in philosophy, and I'm one of them, whose approach to doing philosophy is very different. It doesn't naturally comport itself to, okay, I'm going to write, 5 peer-reviewed articles that are in, these journals this year, right? So this one article I was telling you about is something that's been on my burner for 13 years.
Yeah, I noticed it. I pulled it up. It's a little bit of a lengthy piece, which I think there's something to be said about like a big, honking article, just a lot of, with a lot of meat in there.
Yeah. And this gets at another sort of thing that I think is important, is that not only in terms of like this, quantity over quality, and I don't want to say that, people can't do both, right? There are plenty of people who do quantity and that quantity has quality. So I don't think that those two are exclusive, but the profession certainly has a view of what's going to get someone a job when they're out of grad school, right? And having 1 or 2 publications is crucial. And the reason, there's a couple of reasons that I think that's important. For instance, I read there was a story recently on this issue, and Peter Higgs, right, Nobel Prize winner in physics, basically just came out and said, look, I would not have been able to do the work that I did in today's climate of, these numerical expectations of how much you do. And he talks about how, even at the time, he was a little bit of an embarrassment to the department because every year, like an email, or it wasn't an email, but they would ask, okay, how many publications, does everyone have? And he would just keep submitting nothing, right? And year after year, it was nothing, right? I mean, here's someone who eventually won the Nobel Prize, right? The Higgs boson. And his work style depended upon having, a lot of uninterrupted time to kind of work on a project, right? And it's not just in physics, right? I mean, you look at Kant's Silent Decade. The Critique of Pure Reason was written after 10 years of doing nothing. Yeah. And, it's also not clear to me that, if Kant were, working in a system like the one we have today, that the Critique of Pure Reason ever would have been created, right? If he also, had to crank out one article per year, he just may not have, his critique may have never have occurred. So, there's an issue with respect to, this kind of uniform idea about, what constitutes philosophical value. And, it's interesting. I was talking to a grad student last year, and not from our department. And the grad student told me about something that I hadn't heard before, but it was advice she had been given. And it's a thing kind of within her department. I won't tell you what department she's in either.
Sure.
But it was it's what she called the Department X paper. Of course, Department X was a real department. I don't want to sort of single them out, but the idea was that they had this notion of what was called this Department X paper. And it was a kind of almost a recipe for being able to get published in the field, right? And the recipe is you take something that's topical, it's very focused, it's well argued, it's not necessarily ambitious. You do very good technical work on a particular point. You don't care about the bigger picture. And the thought was that Department X would train its graduate students to do this kind of work, in part because it was a kind of reliable way to make sure you got publications and go on the job market, get a job. And when this, person was telling me about this, it was part of telling me that, other graduate students at her own institution sort of found this kind of disheartening, right? Because there are a lot of students who don't, the way they want to produce philosophical work doesn't necessarily fit that mold, right? They, and there are some whose work does fit that mold, and it's great. I don't want to say that doing things that way is bad. What I do want to say, though, is that having a system that only rewards that one way of doing it while devaluing other ways of doing philosophy is bad. And there was also another graduate student who said something very similar to me once that kind of made me, it kind of crystallized this thought. She said, and this is this amazing graduate student who's just really, really sharp. And at one point she said, I really feel like I need to get away from the department so I can do philosophy. And as soon as she said it, it just crystallized. Like I knew exactly what she meant, right?
Yeah.
Because, and it wasn't necessarily the department she was in, right? It was just the department as, a manifestation of the whole fields, the whole disciplines, view of what constitutes how someone should work. And her own way of working was different enough that she felt she had to remove herself from that in order to do, go through the creative process in the way that she wanted to do it.
Yeah.
And I think there's something really important there, because if you look back at the history of philosophy, and I'll give you a couple of examples, right? Think about Plato's dialogues, or, if Plato were around today and submitted the symposium to OUP, laugh is the right response, right? There is no way that would get published. Can you imagine the reviewer comments that would come back on a Plato dialogue or Spinoza's ethics, right?
Sure.
There seems to be some good ideas here, but why doesn't the author sort of express them clearly and get rid of the pseudo-Euclidean stuff, right?
Oh, gosh.
Think about Wittgenstein's Tractatus or the Investigations. There's no way, right? There's no way to assess this counterfactual, but I'm pretty sure that, Plato, Wittgenstein, Spinoza, if they were going through today's system, they would have dropped out of grad school in the second year and just said, man, this is bullshit. And the reason is that we've now sort of fossilized a certain very narrow understanding of what constitutes a legitimate way of producing philosophical value. And it's a way that it works for some people, but it doesn't work for everybody.
Yeah.
And, I'm one of the people that kind of doesn't really work for. I mean, I can do it, and I've done it. I've got, publications in peer-reviewed journals, and, I've had success in that system. But I always sort of felt, sort of almost like a sellout in some respects, because every time, I would submit something to a journal, I would get, first off, even during the writing process, I would be shaping my work, not necessarily how I wanted to express things, sort of in conformity with my own kind of creative impulse, but in terms of how I thought a venue would want that to look. And then you've got feedback from referees or journal editors who are also then changing this product, right?
Yeah.
Oh, cut out this section or add a section on this or cut out 3,000 words. And all of these things run counter to the work as I wanted to do it, right? The section was there because I wanted it to be there. And so I just felt myself constantly coming up against these, against these two things, this sort of premium on quantity over quality that didn't really resonate with my own work style. And furthermore, the truth that going through the system as it was really decreased the quality of my own work, right, in my own eye, right? If I wanted those 3,000 words gone, I wouldn't have written the article as big as it was to begin with, right? So cutting out those 3,000 words, it might make a journaler happy, but it now renders this piece of philosophical work less good, in my opinion, than what I originally had.
Sure.
And so, I just kind of felt like I was, I don't know, sellout is maybe too strong of a word, but I started feeling alienated from my own work in a way that I think a lot of graduate students also kind of get to that point, right? If their way of doing things doesn't really resonate with kind of the norms of our discipline. And so I almost left. And I have to do a shout out to Janan Ismail. She's probably the main reason that I didn't leave. I talked to her quite a bit about this issue, and she sort of like encouraged me to, not worry about this stuff, just do the work as I want to do it and not worry about these other things.
So did you I know in graduate school, a lot of the graduate students, we talk about this all the time. We talk about like the constraints and we haven't really even gotten to experience it, maybe like you, as far as, like years of, having to conform and shape our work and just really see this. And, but it's already getting to a lot of us in terms of, we have to, you really want to do your work, but then all these, particular issues, with which you have to meet. And I think I might have just lost my train of thought in terms of what I was getting at. I had something I was going to say. It'll come. But it's,
so, well, I can sort of continue on. And
sure. It'll come back. But I mean, generally I had a point of bringing up the fact that this was a particular issue. Yeah. But carry on. It'll come back. So, so what I've done, actually, and, to sort of address this issue with myself so that I don't have to leave the field, sure.
Is I had an epiphany at one point, which is, hey, I can just sort of cut the cord. I can get out of this system. I don't have to continue to sort of, form my work to this way of doing things. And the reason is that, a couple of reasons. One, I have tenure, right? So I'm not in the same kind of position as someone who's a graduate student.
That's what it was. So this is what, in having these conversations, it is once you have tenure, then it's kind of like it's this magical place that you don't have to worry about as much anymore. But I'm wondering, hearing some of what your concerns, that even when you do have it, it's not particularly, there's still, the things you have to do.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things I can say about that. So one is tenure. I think that the tenure process does a couple of things. I think there's a lot of people who go into it thinking, well, once I get tenure, I can do what I want. But the process of going all the way through grad school and then all the way through tenure, it basically ends up conforming people to the process. By the time you get out on the other end, people have become the sort of people that just do the work the way the discipline wants work to be done, right? It kind of, you were a square peg and thinking that you could stay a square peg at the end of tenure, but you become a round peg at the other end of it. If you look at, a lot of the attrition in graduate school, I think, is due to that. Like I said, I'm convinced that, some significant subset of Plato, Spinoza, Wittgenstein would have dropped out of grad school in the second year if they were going through our system now. The other thing I can say is that even once you get tenure, there still are pressures. Sure. It kind of depends on where you are and stuff, but certainly in the UC system, a lot of these things are kind of encoded into the way promotions and advancements are run. And so you can't really get away from, well, you can get away from it, as I'm kind of an example of how you can get away from it. You can get away from it cost-free. Mm-hmm. So, I've paid a price in terms of, some promotion and tenure stuff, but it's a price I'm happy to pay because
quality of life, I imagine, is
quality of life. And also I just think, so, there's a couple of things. Well, basically what I decided I was going to do is just do the work I want to do, right? The work that in my, professional creative judgment, is producing philosophical value in the way I want to produce it. And then at that point, once I've crafted something, I still get feedback. I send it to people who are, people I know who publish in the same areas. I get feedback. I get a digital object identifier, mm-hmm. and then I just put it up on Academia EDU and Phil papers. And that's it. And
really,
I got to tell you, yeah. So,
so you're in, when you write in, you're done. Yeah.
Well, I got to tell you, man, it felt great because it's the first time I did it. There's a paper I have up on temporal experience.
Yeah.
It was the first one I kind of quote published in this way. And when I uploaded it, okay, here's the finished work. I'm not going to be changing it anymore. It's got the DOI. It's up there. I uploaded it. It was amazing, the feeling. And I immediately thought, this is how recording artists who leave the record label feel. Right? Mm-hmm. They feel like they've been part of this label that's been telling them that, oh no, hey Jude, that it can only be 3 minutes and 30 seconds because radio isn't going to play anything that's longer than 3:30. So you got to change your output to conform to whatever. And I got it. I was just like, this feels so good to just take something that is exactly the way I want it to be.
Yeah.
I didn't have to cut out 3,000 words. I didn't have to add a section for some referee. All of which takes time. And it takes a lot of time and effort to make the product worse, in my opinion. And so that's kind of my main process now, is I work on things when they're done to my satisfaction. I make them available, and it's great. And for me, there's kind of a selfish element to it on the one hand, because it just conforms. It means that I can work the way I want to work and produce things of value that are what I want to produce. And these include things such as stuff that's devalued in with our discipline, right? So for instance, here are some things that are devalued. Any kind of work that's purely negative, right? If you submit something as a journal,
you got to submit. You got to have a positive program.
You got to have a positive point, right? That's the philosophical analog of not giving a crap about replicating experiments, right? Which has had a big impact on psychology and some other sciences, right? The fact that there's a lot of results out there that maybe aren't as great as we thought they were because the discipline has not placed any value on replication. When we are telling people that a purely negative argument doesn't have value, that encourages the same kind of issue.
Oh, I'm surprised that I'm surprised I haven't heard that analogy until now, but I'm sure it's been made. But I really like that. Yeah,
and also exegetical work, right? That's also disvalued in our discipline. But there are times when exegetical work has tremendous philosophical value, and so part of it is just like this sort of discomfort I have with understanding the unit of philosophical value as, this Department X paper, right? You've got a positive thesis that you argue for, and it's a well-structured argument, and it's between, 7,500 and 10,000 words, and that's it. And if your name is Wittgenstein, sucks to be you. And if your article is exegetical, too bad. There's just a huge amount of philosophical value, stuff that would contribute tremendously to the philosophical ecosystem.
How do you think we came? I mean, you already said you meant interested in history. How did we come to this point where departments have shaped such that it is the pressures to shape work based on these standards and the values have come to be?
That's a really good question, and I'm not 100% sure.
Sure.
I think one of the issues is that I don't think it's the only one, but I think a contributing factor is that if you're doing a kind of assessment of, trying to say, oh, who's really good, who would be good to hire, whatever, it's just really fast to look at a CV and count publications. And if you can, let your quality control be done by some anonymous referees who, may not actually be experts, to sort of, let you tell yourself you've got assurance that these publications are quality, then it saves you the time of having to read the stuff yourself, right? It's a lot faster to just count things than it is to read and come up with your own assessment. And so I think that's been one of the things that's kind of nudged us in that direction. Sure. But I don't know if that's the only one. I think there are probably other things as well.
Yeah, I just had a thought because I know there's been a lot of history of science work that has pushed folks toward considering how people justify their projects and how the NSF and including significance and broader impacts in folks' work has then changed the types of research projects that people do. But I just didn't know if as much history has been done toward like history of philosophical departments, history of philosophy departments, essentially.
That would be fascinating to see.
So I really love what you're doing, and I think that's fantastic, and I am very encouraged by this model. So what are you telling your advisees in terms of doing? Because I would be hard-pressed to say maybe right away that this is what to do, but,
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Definitely not. I mean, I tell people often, don't do what I do.
Okay.
That's a very common piece of advice I give people. And, but one of the reasons that it's important for me, I think, to do this, right, to sort of pull out of the system the way it's currently conceived, is that I know there are a lot of people who are like me in this respect, right, that they feel like they're kind of selling out and don't feel like they're really able to express their own creative work the way they want to. Sure. And the system's not going to change unless some people start pressuring the system. Right. And so, in addition to the kind of, self-serving motivations, right, this is great for my own work, I enjoy doing it more, and my work is more like the way I want it to be. In addition to those things, I also, hope that it's going to, maybe be a nudge in the direction for the field of starting to take more seriously things like the Jennifer Whiting thing, right? Where, it's a suggestion about being different, taking a different approach to our assessment of what constitutes philosophical value for tenure assessments, for example. And so, the hope would be that maybe some other people would say, hey, what that Grush guy is doing is pretty, people who have tenure, right? People who have tenure and who are big names in the field who aren't in any danger of losing a job, might say, hey, that's an interesting approach. Why don't we do it? Now, there's a lot of problems. What I'm doing is not universalizable, and I know it, right? But I don't know what the better solution is in terms of how our discipline, assesses quality and what our view of philosophical value is. But I know that the current system isn't it. Sure. And I also know that, you can help find a global minimum, even if you don't know where the global minimum is, just by adding energy to the system, right? Just by, increasing the temperature enough to knock things out of its current local minimum can help it find a better minimum. And so that's another part of what I'm trying to do here is to kind of, try to jostle the system a little bit.
So I talked to also Kyle. Have you, so is this in particular, I know UC has an do they have an open access journal? And if so, is this something you would consider doing, or is that kind of a separate thing? Is that still kind of part of the, part of the shaping, or like, it's not totally free to, there's self-publishing. I think it's great. I just wondering, in this sort of middle ground of open access journals.
Well, open access, I think, is incredibly important because, and this is a soapbox that I have been on a number of times, because I think it's really a social evil to sort of continue to support commercial publishers. Yeah. Because, people, for a number of reasons, right? I mean, if you step back and look at it, let me describe the way the system works to you.
Yep.
We have researchers, scientists, and let's just say philosophers, whose salary is paid for by taxpayer money, by student fees. They're paying for us to do work, to do research, among other things. We then take that research, sign over copyright to a commercial interest that then makes the taxpayers and those student fees pay for it again before they can have access to it. Worse, they then put a huge amount of effort into limiting access of that work. If you're lucky, you're a student at a Western university.
Sure.
If you're not lucky, you are one of the 99% of people across the world who just literally cannot get access to that work. And you are contributing to this class society in academia, right? On the one hand, you've got the students who are at the wealthy Western universities who can afford the cutting edge journals, who can afford access to these books. And then on the other hand, you've got everybody else who can't get them. I remember there was one of the times I was on a soapbox about this, I got some emails from people around the world, one of whom was a guy, he was a teacher at a community college in Canada, a sort of Native American, they call them First Nations community college. Mm-hmm. And he said that his college can't afford anything. The only journal subscription he has for his students is one journal subscription that he pays for out of his own pocket. And this is a guy who's probably not making any money, right, at all. Yeah. And yet all of the people, who are at these, R1 institutions, whose salary is being paid for by student fees that, of course, we all complain about, like, oh, it's horrible if these fees are going up. Well, yeah, I guess part of the reason these fees are so high is because you're not only drawing salary from their fees, you're giving copyright over to a place that's going to then charge them again for all of that, right? People don't think about that.
No, it's not really made explicit as to what these fees are doing.
Yeah. But people just don't have access to that work. And so I think open access is tremendously important because it sort of helps defuse this class divide in academia between, the Western Anglophone rich people who are going to get all the jobs because they have access to all the cutting edge research and everybody else, right? The people in Eastern Europe or Africa or, wherever they might be who just don't have access to cutting edge stuff and as a result are never going to be as competitive for jobs and what have you. Yeah. But, as long as our system places this sort of fetishized value on, the traditional peer-reviewed journal, almost all of which are commercial. And, the thing you really need to do in your career is to publish a book with OUP, right, or some commercial press. People in students in Eastern Europe, they have to work several days before they can afford one OUP book. Okay. It is, as one graduate student there told me once, it's a luxury item, right, to be able to afford any of these books, right? But people, at our R1 institutions just constantly do that. You do the work, you give it over to someone who's going to limit its access to other wealthy people, and you don't think twice about it. And so, something like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is fantastic. I think that's been an amazing positive thing in access because now anybody in the world who has an internet browser can get top-notch stuff. And, Philosopher's Imprint is a great journal. It's peer-reviewed. It's open access. Anybody in the world with a browser has access to that. So at a minimum, I'd like to see our field go in that direction, the open access direction. I'm sort of going a step further because, Philosopher's Imprint still has, some other issues, right? It still is, it is going to limit the kind of things that get published in certain kind of ways that have to do with, what I think of as the kind of creative style of the work or, the specifics there. So I'm going a little bit farther than that, but open access, I think, is a tremendously important thing. And it's, I can sort of summarize it very quickly. Like one of the most ironic things I've ever seen is once I was looking for an article on educational justice, and I happened to be off campus. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have access to journals through, the normal campus thing that, we get if we're affiliated with an R1 institution. And there was some article on educational justice, right? Distribution of, educational goods. And when I went to sort of get it, it was access denied. You do not, you need to pay $41 for this. I said, oh, this is great, right? So this article on educational justice is itself only available to the wealthy people who can afford it. And if you're one of the 99% of the people in the world, again, sucks to be you.
Oh
anyway,
my gosh.
if there's a more perfect encapsulation of what's
I love that.
that system.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking of what I have access to. And it's interesting, in Indiana, there's about 5 or 6 campuses, but you'll look through the OneSearch where everything is available, and sometimes certain works will only be available for branch campuses, which is really weird. So it's like, so we're at IU Bloomington, and then there's Indiana University Kokomo, or IUPUI, Indiana University, Purdue University. So it's interesting that I don't know why that is or how that is. I mean, it's like an electronic source. Why is it restricted or kept? It just kind of feeds into this limitation and restriction of this work is unfortunate. I'm sure it has to do with like who's paying for what access and what your particular school has paid for in terms of access, but it's just unfortunate. I think it's just not more freely available and things. So no, that's really fascinating. And so I imagine the issues, the cultures, what we really value as far as work and feeling constrained about what we can do. That's really that's tough, and it is tough as philosophers that something we don't have a lot of say. And I think philosophy is also not a particularly I'm sure scientists are ones that complain, and as well as other kinds of artists too. The only other folks, I don't know if you know any playwrights or anything, but playwrights are actually particularly, it's nice that I think they pretty much, everyone has to go by what they write. Their word is the law. So directors, producers, everything like that. There's, I don't know. I think you might appreciate that from your own style, is that it's very unshapable. Like, obviously if you're trying to get your play produced in a theater, maybe you might think about writing this kind of play, but there's like just the craft and the way it works it's very weird how like the written word of the play is sort of as it is. And it's almost like, it's just interesting. It's interesting how I suppose in different cultures and different kinds of creative works, we face different, restrictions and, I suppose levels in which we must conform to a particular way and how it's valued. And it's unfortunate in philosophy that that's the case now.
It is. But, anyone who's in a position to kind of do some of the stuff I've been doing in terms of just like publishing things on your own, I can highly recommend it. I mean, there's a reason that, Louis C.K. decided to take way less money from FX to retain more creative control over his series, which is that.
Did you see the Horace and Pete show or what, or was it the Louis show that you were referring to?
The current one, the sort of Louis on, I think it's on FX.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, which is just an amazing, amazing show. And one of the reasons I think it's amazing is that he kept a lot of creative control, even though it cost him, right? They would have given him a lot more money, but he sort of negotiated to keep more creative control himself, but then he ended up getting a lot less. But there's a reason for that. And so, if at some point anyone's in a position to kind of, do that themselves, I can guarantee you'll like it, right? It'll just feel great when you publish something and it's exactly the way you want it to be, and it hasn't been adulterated by any, weird suggestions that don't really sort of resonate with your own vision of how you want that piece of work to be. I think
that's a really nice example of somewhat outside of philosophy, but still very representative, I think, of, and I'm sure it would be nice to see like yourself, and it'd be great to see like a collection of academics who are starting to do this, folks who are publishing on their own, and then ultimately starting to see the impact that has. Maybe that could hope to, swing the tide, swing the pendulum toward this. I don't even know if it's ever been back to the other way, toward the way you're hoping it to go. But, and also address, the last thing I would say is address the issue of, of doing what you want to do in creativity. Sometimes it's couched in as like, of course you can do that, but you got to do this other work first. Like you got to have your standard line of quantity papers, and then of course you go off and write 1,000-word essay or something, or 1,000-page essay. Who cares, as long as you do that with, again, this sort of requirement that you fill the quantity requirement. And speaking to that, saying, well, look, you're gonna get greater value by allowing one to not have the quantity requirement in the same kind of way, or that need not be the case for everybody.
Right, and in fact, that's kind of the main lesson of the Jennifer Whiting piece, right? Is that there are contexts, in particular, women and how they're, with their, things about the way women work and their other kind of family pressures and stuff, where having that numerical requirement just really is a problem. And sort of more generally, right, I'm sure you've heard about this, but, one of the arguments for increasing diversity in the field, right, sort of gender diversity and racial diversity and LGBT, and people cite a lot, like studies that just show that having a more diverse environment is good for results. It's good for productivity, right? There are studies about that. But if we're serious about that, I mean, if we really believe that's true in general, right, we don't just cite it because it's a convenient justification for the types of diversity we already value, right, like gender balance and stuff, then it applies to the same sort of thing. People whose way of approaching work, they work on one thing for 4 years, and that's a type of diversity, right? You've got people like Kant, who spends 10 years on the Critique of Pure Reason. You can look back at the history of philosophy and just say, look, having this approach, having a field that allows different people to do things in different ways, whether it's Plato's dialogues or Spinoza with his crazy pseudo-Euclidean stuff, or Kant, who takes 10 years off to write the Critique of Pure Reason.
Sure.
We know, right, it's not speculation, we know that kind of thing has paid big philosophical dividends, right, having a culture in the past that has allowed for these different kinds of approach. And the kind of uniform, homogenous way we're doing it now is really cutting that off. And so I think that's an argument, like you were saying, even against this idea that, well, first you do the numbers, game, and then you can do what you want.
Yeah.
I think the numbers game, that would have been enough to get Plato, Spinoza, and Wittgenstein to just leave grad school,
do something else, work in English lit or something. I mean, I don't know.
Engineering, or who knows?
Ooh, just completely give up philosophy altogether.
Lens grinding.
Right? Yeah.
And one other thing,
sure.
That I'll mention, sort of an advantage of kind of one of the ways I'm doing things now with some of these publications is, and I haven't done it yet with the things I've put up so far because I didn't have the idea yet, but an idea I had recently that I'm going to start implementing, and I can implement because now I've got full creative control over what I'm doing, is the following. In addition to sort of like a philosophical work, right, that, on some topic, what I think I'm going to try to do is then, maybe contact some junior people, whether they're pre-tenure or graduate students who, work in the field, right, who don't necessarily have a name for themselves yet, and just say, hey, I've got this, article on whatever it is, temporal representation, and, you work in this field, if you want to, it'd be great to have a commentary. You could read this, you could sort of write a response. I'll reply to your response and just have that packaged as part of the thing that gets published. And the reason is that this idea came to me is that, the things that I put up, like this temporal representation article that has been up like 6 months or so, right? I'm one of the, whatever, 6 or 10 people or whatever that, is kind of known for publishing in this area, right?
Sure.
People have argued against my position and whatever, and, there's been back and forth. And so, this article's been downloaded a couple hundred times, right? So, it's easy for me as someone who's been in the field for a while and kind of has an established name to say, okay, I'm going to publish in this way because I've kind of like built up enough, whatever name recognition that, that can kind of work. But it's not necessarily going to work for people who are still in the process of making a name for themselves, right? And so one of the things I think I'm going to try to do is to kind of, use this as a way to help people, right? Who are maybe graduate students or maybe who are, still trying to get name recognition within, the subfield that they're in.
To
to sort of get their name out there a little bit more, including there's also a big issue with women, right? Like trying to get more women on, syllabi of classes and get more women on, to be represented more, equitably in conferences and stuff like that. And I think that even within publishing, there is the same kind of issue. And so, it would be a way of sort of trying to, identify, women who are in the process of making a name for themselves in the field, and kind of like trying to, help give them a little bit of a boost too. I don't know. We'll see if that works out. It's an idea, but
I think that's a phenomenal idea. Yeah, no, I think I'm really interested to hear, how it goes and how it works. Is this something that is still in the works, or have you done yet, or have a paper you're thinking about doing that yet with?
I'm going to try it with whatever's next. I don't know which paper is going to be finished up and kind of out the pipeline next, but it's something I'm going to try to do, and we'll see how it works. But that's like I keep on saying, that's one of the great things about having creative control over what you're doing.
Yeah.
Is that you can then just do what you want to do, including maybe something like this. Now it may end up not working out for whatever reason. I don't know, but I'm going to give it a shot.
Well, I certainly think you'll get, at least with some graduate students, you'll certainly get people to be willing to comment. I could, but yeah, so, see how it goes, and if it brings fruition. If anything, it could bring folks together as well, to interact and to, again, like just from my own personal experience, I don't happen to work on this particular your particular subject, but if I was, contacted or, recruited to say, hey, we would love to invite some commentary, that could be of interest, to some folks, and, at least people to get people together to maybe, do some other collaborative projects.
Right.
Great. So, why don't we finish up with maybe the last thing we could just briefly chat about is this project you're doing now with the podcast that you'll be starting up, a diversity podcast. Right. I imagine this is tackling some of these issues. If you want to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I will. So there's a podcast that I am doing with Danielle Wiley. She's a junior faculty at Mississippi State. And the topic of the podcast, or kind of our what we're first generation students and students from low income backgrounds in philosophy in particular. And there's a huge number of issues in how prestige bias and how the kind of head start that students who are not first generation or come from more affluent backgrounds get in our field. And sure. It's something that, we're both really excited about, because it's just, the more you dig into it, the more fascinating it is. We've recorded the first episode, but it's not up yet. Mm-hmm. And so depending on when this episode that you and I are now recording, when that airs, mm-hmm. It may be up or it may not. It's sure. called Occupy Philosophy is the name of nice. The podcast. So the URL is occupyphilosophy.org. And, there's going to be a blog associated with it, and we're going to do a monthly podcast. And it should be a lot of fun. Danielle is fantastic. She also is a first-generation student, from a low-income background. And nice. She's got some really interesting experiences with how that plays out and trying to go through academia. That would be, if I was going to plug something, that would be it. Absolutely. Also, I want to plug the UCSD summer program for women in philosophy.
Okay.
Everyone should definitely check that out.
Is that an undergrad or graduate program, or?
It's undergraduate. So that was kind of my previous diversity project. I kind of put that thing together and ran it for the first 2 years. Other people are now running it, but it's it's every summer, and there's between 12 and 16 undergrads from all over the country, women who are undergraduates who are interested in pursuing philosophy in graduate school. And, we bring them out. There's a couple of instructors who teach a 2-week-long sort of intensive courses. And it's kind of a way to sort of get a kind of a kickstart into doing graduate work in philosophy. And we've had 3. It's gone for 3 years so far. It's sort of gearing up for its 4th year. And it's just an amazing program. All of the participants have been fantastic. Mm-hmm. The people who've instructed the courses, we have prominent women in the field from outside UCSD who also come in to teach the courses, so that our own graduate students can interact with, female faculty, also from other departments, as well as these undergraduates. And so there's this, 2-week Women in Philosophy Fest. It's just this amazing thing. And so any undergraduate women who are listening to this, or anyone in general who knows undergraduate women interested, definitely check out the UCSD summer program for women in philosophy.
Well, this is wonderful. I'll certainly circulate it around Indiana, as well as hopefully those who are listening. Certainly pass this along. This sounds great. Well, Rick, it's been fabulous. We've covered a lot of ground. It's been great to learn about your background and where you've come from. And it seems like carrying on some of these diversity initiatives, from your early life and kind of going on is doing quite well for you. And it's really exciting to hear about all these different kinds of projects that you're up to.
Yeah, well, thanks. It's actually been a lot of fun to sit down and chat. It's been great.
Yeah, it's been fabulous. Well, I do hope you have a good rest of the evening. Are you happening to go to the PSA this year?
Not sure yet. That is yet to be decided.
To be decided. You still have a few days to decide. Yeah, we're recording this just before the PSA. I unfortunately will not be there this particular term.
Well, then I'm not going.
No, you're not going. Yeah, I went 2014. That was nice. That was in Chicago. That was a good time. But yeah, unfortunately this year will not make it out. But I hope whatever you decided will be nice. And yeah, if you ever come through Indiana, do say hello.
Definitely will. Yeah, it's been fantastic. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks, Rick. I'll talk to you soon.